I want to welcome Daniel Hirshey. He's our presenter tonight. And Daniel is going to be speaking. The title of his talk is Navigating Guilt, Shame, and Responsibility in Mental Illness. And before Daniel gets into his talk, I just wanted to ask Daniel if you could just give us a little bit of an overview of who you are and what you're all about.
Sure. Thanks for that intro. I'm Daniel Hirshey. I'm 34 years old. I live in Worcester, Massachusetts these days, but I spent most of my adolescence and adulthood in Santa Fe. I have been a volunteer off and on with NAMI Santa Fe for 5 or 6 years now. And I think, I usually don't lead with my diagnosis, but I think it's important context also for what I'm sharing tonight. I have a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And that will become clear why that's kind of important context when I get into my talk. I spend a lot of my free time playing video games, reading, writing. I try to educate myself and I've pursued a little bit of psychology education, but I am not a clinician or a therapist. I'm exclusively speaking tonight too as just someone with the lived experience. So that's the only kind of authority I'm bringing to what I'm saying tonight. But I guess that's sort of it. that's an intro.
That sounds good, Daniel. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your courage and sharing your story with us. This is a lot of what NAMI is all about is people with lived experience that share their story and let others know that when it comes to having a mental health challenge or a mental illness, that they are not alone, that a lot of us out there in the world, something like 1 in 5 struggle with some form of a mental illness. I know I do with depression. And so really admire your courage and sharing your story with us tonight. For the participants, we are going to hold questions until after Daniel's talk, but if you do have a question and you would like to go ahead and pop it in the chat along the way, that's certainly fine. We'll get to it after Daniel's finished. And with that, take it away, Daniel.
All right, I'm going to share my screen here. I put together some slides, mostly as like a guide for myself. Here, I'll do that. And go full screen. Okay, are those slides coming through? Is everyone seeing those?
Looks good.
Okay. Great. Yeah. I kind of gave my little intro, and this is the content of my talk. So I want to give a couple disclaimers at the beginning. I do mention in a very generalized way some suicidal ideation throughout my talk. So I want to kind of put a trigger warning out there. If anyone feels like they need to leave or need to take care of themselves, I encourage them to do that. And I also am not a mental health professional. I'm not an academic. These are my own kind of definitions. These are my own perspectives. There may be some overlap because I've done a lot of extensive work in therapy, but these are kind of my personal philosophical perspectives that I have put together and things that I have learned through my own experience. So I encourage everyone to kind of take anything that is helpful, and if something is not helpful, just leave it where it is. What I hope to do throughout the course of this presentation is I'm going to kind of define the terms that I'm working with here. Guilt, toxic guilt, and weaponized guilt. I will be defining shame, toxic shame, and weaponized shame. I want to talk a little bit in a general sense about responsibility, what that means in this context, and kind of what that looks like. And I hope to expound upon how guilt and shame can help or hinder our healing and in recovery. Things that we ought to become responsible for and why we should become responsible for them. And I have a section on primarily for family members and loved ones, just suggestions, ways you can help support someone in becoming responsible or help someone navigating shame and guilt, which a lot of us have. And just a brief section kind of on practicing acceptance for the things that we ultimately are not in control of and we're not responsible for. But with that, I'll jump right into some definitions. So start with just basic guilt. The feeling of blame or responsibility for a perceived error, mistake, or wrongdoing. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. And then shame is a view that something is wrong with ourselves, often due to a perceived error, mistake, or wrongdoing. So shame is the internalized view of ourself as being wrong, and guilt is we've done something wrong. So that's kind of how I look at it. I think both can potentially be useful in the sense that they let us know when we perhaps need to change an attitude, a behavior, or a belief, and that we have done something that contradicts our principles or our values or some belief that we have about ourselves. And if we can use those inclinations and feelings to put into an appropriate context, they can actually be useful. The next term is kind of where that goes wrong. And so when I refer to toxic shame and guilt, what I'm talking about is a feeling of shame or guilt that has become internalized in a way that it becomes an obstacle to growth or an instrument of self-flagellation that kind of perpetuates our suffering and the things we're trying to heal from and grow through. This is a feeling that persists in spite of our attempts to learn from our mistakes and correct our wrongdoings. This is also, as far as shame goes, this is taking it on a deep identity level. And so a few examples of that would just be a belief that I am weak and pathetic. I'm a terrible person and that isn't going to change. Things that we believe about ourselves that spring from maybe things that we've done wrong or that we've made an error in. And I think fundamentally toxic shame and guilt is an obstacle. It is not helpful. It is taken maybe the helpful message and we've told ourselves a story about it that is not helping us move forward and is not really constructive. And then weaponized shame and guilt. When I say that, I mean it's a kind of an incorrect or uncharitable assumption or belief directed at someone that instill or perpetuate toxic shame or guilt. And to me, that's just kind of the basic mental health stigma. I think, a few of those would be the manifestations of our illnesses and behavior are due to character flaws, some sort of personal weakness or moral deficiency. The idea that, schizophrenics or people with bipolar or people who are mentally ill or violent would be another example of that. And this is one that I've heard from acquaintances and friends and other people who struggle. The old, why can't you just be normal, is another example of that. I try to look at these through the most charitable light, and I think they are often born out of ignorance and fear rather than deliberate malice or cruelty. People who don't know any better make assumptions that aren't necessarily true. And I don't think every attempt at trying to put that on someone is necessarily deliberate malice or cruelty. It's often just done from not knowing or being scared. I'll give a little brief history here too, before I launch into a lot more. I first started experiencing symptoms around the age of 16, and that looked like sleep disturbance. What I would now look back and say is more like clinical depression, so long-term depression. I started using drugs regularly in those years. I was still in high school. I started drinking more and basically was just experimenting or taking anything I could. That somehow I graduated. Still don't know how I graduated, but I got a diploma. And after getting out of high school, I got a part-time job and was just kind of coasting for a while. But I started using more and more, in terms of mind-altering substances. I also just very quietly started kind of retreating into my own distorted and confused world. That culminated in my first episode of psychosis, which psychosis to me is just like a break from reality. So I started seeing and hearing things that weren't there. I started believing things that were like outlandish, kind of like, you know, the weirdest sci-fi novel you've ever read was kind of my day-to-day life. And that culminated in a series of hospitalizations, and that was kind of where I first had any sort of interactions with the mental health care system. As I went through that, I was in super denial. I had no awareness that what I was experiencing was a mental illness. And I also, part of the delusions were that, you know, it didn't feel like I was the one that with the distorted perceptions. It felt like everyone around me had the distorted perceptions. And I was just not willing to accept that I had a mental illness, because I believe that like that carried a lot of baggage. The stigma around having serious mental health conditions is significant, and I didn't know any better, so I believed that all of that applied to me. I was also, this is less related to like a mental illness thing, but more just a young adult thing. But I had a lot of anger and resentment for issues I was facing, for insecurity. I was not willing to take responsibility for anything, so I blamed my brother, I blamed my family for kind of a slightly dysfunctional upbringing. I blamed, you know, anything but myself. I was not willing or ready to look at that. And the drugs and alcohol got worse and worse. And I would take anything, literally anything that was given to me, and be excited about that prospect. And I started kind of engaging in like petty crime, and also stealing from people I cared about to stay high. And that was just another kind of avoidant strategy that I had. It dulled the pain a little bit. I'll just read this next little segment. I was in deep denial and couldn't accept the reality that I was losing control. My delusions and paranoia felt more real than the alternative perspectives. I began slipping into increasingly dangerous and sometimes criminal behavior to compensate for deep shame and insecurity, and to afford to continue to abuse substances. I lied to my family, friends, and healthcare professionals to avoid accepting what I perceived was a moral failing and a demonstration of weakness. It was sometimes easier to live in my delusions, as scary as those became, than to take responsibility for the direction my life was going in, the people I was hurting, and the choices I was making. So I had a super wrong view, completely born of ignorance of what it meant to have a mental health condition, and I didn't want any part of that. And ironically, I do think that my first episode of psychosis probably saved my life, because I was going in a really, really bad direction. And whatever else, all the bad that came with it, I was also kind of taken out of my current mode of operation in psychosis and put on a different path. So I want to talk a little bit about some early obstacles to treatment that I think other people could definitely relate to. It was very difficult at first to find an appropriate diagnosis, and also as a consequence of that, a good treatment plan. I started feeling like I was bad and wrong, rather than like, hey, you're struggling with something, hey, these things you're doing are bad and wrong. But I started feeling like I was kind of like an irredeemable person, and that there was something wrong with me on a fundamental level, not just like a mental health condition. And I made things worse. The first few years I was in and out of hospitals. There was a lot of trauma related to that. There was a lot of, you know, continuing to use drugs. I couldn't hold a job at that point either. So it was just kind of a death spiral, and that lasted for years. I also don't think I ever really fully came out of psychosis, because the medication kind of cocktails that they were throwing at me just didn't work. And yeah, continued to compound the shame and guilt by just saying and behaving in ways that I, under normal circumstances, absolutely wouldn't have. And that definitely doesn't make things easier when you have a moment of lucidity and you kind of realize, oh, well, this is what you've been doing, this is what you've been up to, and these are the things you've been saying to carry on with all of that weight of those experiences. And early on, especially, my support system really couldn't help me. They tried, but they didn't know what was happening either. They didn't have an education in mental health. That didn't really change until members of my family got involved with NAMI. But you know, a lot of those early attempts were not helpful. And there was kind of a battle, a power control kind of battle that happened as a result of that. So even as a young guy, when I was more lucid, I didn't blame them as much. Certainly after I started getting some actual help, I realized everyone was just doing the best they could and what they thought was right, even if it didn't work out. So I started getting better when I ended up in a long-term treatment center for the mentally ill. This was about 2.5 years after my first foray into psychosis. And I struggled with suicidality and suicidal ideation a lot in those early years. But at this point, I was like particularly just ready to throw in the towel. So when I kind of woke up in this treatment center, I was like, you know what? Let's give it one last chance. Let's just do what they're offering here and see if it helps. You know, what do I have to lose at this point, right? I found a helpful medication, and it was a singular medication. So it wasn't a cocktail of drugs that had bad side effects. It was one medication. It was super helpful. It was kind of like a light switch. And I started to come out of psychosis for the first time in like 2.5 years. It was also the first extended period of sobriety. I did not use drugs at all while I was there. There were lots of people doing that, and I, you know, just made the decision that that wasn't what I was going to be doing. I was going to be focusing on treatment and trying to get better. And this was also the first time I learned a little bit about mental illness and mental health diagnoses and what I was dealing with specifically, which gave me the language to kind of communicate better with my doctor and with my family and my healthcare professionals, as well as kind of broke through some of that, the early stigma and the false beliefs I had about what it meant to have a mental health condition. I went through a process of intensive therapy to address the guilt, the shame, and the insecurity I was facing, and like the belief, the really negative self-beliefs I had about myself. I was definitely bordering on self-hate. That was the first time I had really confronted the toxic shame and guilt, and was able to view it in more of a normal light. Okay, there are things that I've done that have made this situation worse. There are people that I've harmed in this process through my direct actions. There's also an element of that that is not helpful. And believing that I'm irredeemable kind of makes me irredeemable on a fundamental level. If I believe I'm just this way, you know, there's no way to change that. So I let go of a lot of that. I also stopped trying to lie to myself as much. You know, I believed my bullshit. I believed my lies. And you know, it's that was a difficult kind of threshold to break through as well. And for the first time, I started taking an active role in my behavior and my mental health. That hadn't happened up to this point. Anyone who was trying to help me, whether they were good at it or bad or did the right thing or the wrong thing, I fought them every step of the way. And so instead of fighting the people who were at least trying to help me, I decided to direct that energy and attention towards my condition and the difficulties I was facing with that. And I think another thing that really helped me was just accepting that there was no going back. I wasn't going to have the pre-psychosis brain. I wasn't going to be able to just live perfect, normal, whatever that is, life anymore. And so I had to kind of find new ways of thinking and new ways of going forward. Accepting responsibility. So that was the huge kind of turning point where I started to try and become responsible for myself and my condition. And I think I just kind of want to spell out what I'm talking about specifically within the context, because responsibility means a lot of things in a lot of different contexts. But in this specific context, I'm talking about ways in which our behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes can negatively affect our own well-being, our place within society, the prognosis of our conditions, and our relationships with others. That is, I'm not talking about, taking the weight of everything on your shoulders, but those specific things are what I think we can, in most instances, and should at least try to be responsible for. And then why? Why should we try to accept that responsibility? I have a few answers for that. So we can learn the lessons that the guilt and shame are trying to teach us. The points where we've actually done something that contradicts our values or our beliefs, and that we can correct, so we don't just do the loop-de-loop over and over again, repeating the same errors and making the same mistakes. The world, its institutions, and many people will also hold us accountable for our words, beliefs, and actions. That includes during a mental health episode, whether that is fair or not. That is something that was very difficult for me to come to terms with, and still requires like a level of maturity to kind of wrestle with and grapple with that. But I think it is through the process of trying to become responsible that I came into touch with really what was and wasn't within my ability to control. Up until that point, it was kind of all or nothing. I either, was completely in control and a terrible person because of it, or I didn't want any of that control and I was just mentally ill, and that's what was happening. So I think there's a kind of a black and white thinking that I was dealing with, and through the process of trying to become responsible, I was able to differentiate those things. I do think living a life of honest reflection and responsibility does lessen the burden of shame and guilt. I think shame and guilt, there are things I definitely still struggle with in that regard, but I do think over time, trying to make changes where you can and, be the best version of yourself, it does lessen the load a little bit. And I think for the things that we can't control, it's a little bit of an attempt to mitigate some of the negative attributes and effects that our conditions impose upon us, and keep it from seeping into our relationships and behaviors as much. I think the beginning of that, and I'll just lightly touch on this, was accepting my condition. I had to, initially it wasn't even the diagnosis that I accepted, but I just accepted that I was struggling and that I needed help. I had to throw the Goodwill Hunting in there because that was a huge part of it. I wasn't bad. It wasn't what I did. I didn't ask for it. It wasn't my fault, but here we are. So we got to deal with it. Fundamentally, I had to challenge the ignorant perceptions of what it meant to have a diagnosis. Like I said, I did that through education. I did that through directing my attention towards skills and practices and ways of thinking to help mitigate my symptoms a little bit and deal with the direct consequences of those things. And fundamentally, I've held to this principle throughout the whole time. I do not worry myself or concern myself overly with the label, the diagnosis. I think that is a thing that the doctors need to be very concerned about, because that's going to dictate treatment. I want to be aware of what my diagnosis means and entails, but I'm not trying, because they carry weight. A diagnosis of schizophrenia carries a certain degree of weight. A diagnosis of bipolar carries a certain degree of weight, and whether those perceptions are accurate or not, I don't need any more weight. So I kind of have just let the doctors deal with that. And so this is kind of the process that I begin with for accepting responsibility. And that began also with cultivating an ability to honestly look at myself, at my role in my circumstances and what I was doing and what I was capable of and what I wasn't doing and all of it. And that required a lot of help, a lot of education, and a lot of therapy. I also, again, this is less directly related to the chronic mental health conditions, but more just dysfunction, personality kind of quirks and stuff, was I lied a lot. If I didn't lie, I hid the truth. I didn't tell the full truth. And I blamed other people and held a lot of resentment, even if I didn't outright blame them for my circumstances and things that were happening to me. I had to dig through that. That was uncomfortable. That was very ugly. But I had to most of that stuff just got thrown in the trash because regardless if it was true or not, it wasn't useful to me. I also, for the first time, started to unpack some of the delusions I was operating with, which up until that point were just things that were happening in my head that I never talked about, that nobody knew about. That I just very briefly in that place kind of opened the window into that. And in subsequent years, I've kind of, knocked the wall out or whatever. But I talk about it all the time now. And that does help me kind of differentiate between the delusional parts and the things I've experienced in psychosis that sometimes feel more real than reality. So that's an ongoing effort, but that was an essential component as well. I began to slowly and piece by piece kind of take ownership of the part that I had played, right or wrong. That was a very gradual process, a gentle process. The therapist I worked with was really great because I had this tendency to say, take all the burden or none of it, and so it was kind of gradually taking things out of a backpack and putting things in to kind of get to a more reasonable place of things that I did have to live with and had to accept the consequences for, and things that ultimately were not my fault. And, right or wrong, I kind of had to develop a way to differentiate between the two. Like I said, it was very painful. It was very ugly. There were days where I really didn't like myself, and then days where I was like, oh, this is what it feels like to actually be okay with yourself. So I tried to find some balance there. And I would just, anyone who's going through that, you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to become, the most responsible person all at once, or, make amends to everyone all at once. Be gentle with yourself, do it piece by piece, give it time. And I think fundamentally that through this process, I was able to let go of some of the toxic shame and guilt through changing my behavior and changing my beliefs and attitudes about certain things. Developing a philosophy, ways of navigating these things interpersonally. And that was a very beginning process, and I'm still working that out. But I think through the process of trying to change and become better, I was able to let go of kind of these negative beliefs about myself that were ultimately like self-defeating, self-fulfilling prophecies. This is kind of what the process looked like, just some examples. I think I started with identifying a problem. So something that I was doing, saying, believing, even an attitude that I had about something. And, if it was something that was in my power to change, I tried to make an effort to change it. So I wasn't repeating the same cycle over and over. I was trying to address these things on a fundamental level. I started and always start with letting go of blame. If I'm going into this process and I'm wanting to point fingers, that is a useless exercise for me. So I focus on what my role in it, my 50%, and what I can do to address that. I don't have specific prescriptions for what someone should do to help. I don't really believe in kind of cookie cutter approaches. Things that helped me were education, both in a formal education, a little bit in college. the education I received through the mental health program I was in, the long-term treatment center, and books I've picked up. Lots of therapy. I'm not always in therapy these days, but you know, I go through periods where I do therapeutic work. That has been essential. Some self-help books, things like that, just keeps me motivated and engaged in that same way. And support groups. It's really nice when you don't have to explain yourself to a group of people as much. You know, everyone kind of gets it, and you can all kind of work through it and seek solutions together. I think this is the exact part where you can kind of differentiate between what is and not within your ability to control. And so through attempting to change and hitting a wall, and kind of the example of that, I have been through times where I was doing everything right on paper. You know, I was in therapy every week. I was working with a doctor. I was open and honest with my doctor. I was pursuing all kinds of alternative modalities, practices, skills, and I still went through, you know, three very difficult hospitalizations and basically a year of psychosis. And that was while under a doctor's care, while in therapy and all of that. So I kind of realized, oh yeah, there's a ceiling here. I do have actual limitations, and I need to be a little more gentle with myself there. Some examples of what responsibility looks like, or things that responsibility, like methods of becoming responsible within this context. The idea of making amends. I know a lot of us, you know, hurt our relationships with our families, hurt our relationships with our friends. So getting right with them, owning our part in it. Getting sober was a huge one. Like didn't correct my underlying issues, but you know, it was a huge obstacle to actually dealing with them. So, and then just in a general sense, complying with treatment. You know, I was my biggest sabotage early on. Like I said, I fought everyone every step of the way. And so if I didn't like the treatment, I wouldn't throw away the whole treatment. I'd look for another solution. You know, it's kind of like don't leave your job before you find a new one type thing. I think fundamentally it takes courage to ask for help. It certainly did with me. I thought I knew everything, and I didn't want to admit that I didn't, and that I was scared and I needed help. So be open to making changes, and that goes for behaviors as well as beliefs, the fundamental beliefs. That can be a very tumultuous process, but sometimes we need to kind of lay a new foundation. It is definitely often a bit of trial and error. You will make mistakes, and you are not your mistakes. So if you're actively engaged in the process of becoming responsible, you're going to mess up, and that can be really painful, but that doesn't mean you're not actively working on things, and it's okay. It's part of the process. And I think a philosophical kind of structure that I use a lot is not to dwell in the problem. If I find myself just circling and circling on a problem, or why is this happening, or how does it, you know, I instead just focus on solutions and try and find a way out of it. I think this process, and I know this process can be really ugly and painful. I do think in becoming responsible, it's how we grow, heal, and work towards being better versions of ourselves. This is more when we hit that wall and finally realize, oh, this is something I can't become responsible for, I'm not in control of. You're going to feel helpless. You're going to feel like, you know, okay, like this, I'm at the whim of something else that I'm not directly behind the wheel of. I definitely felt a lot of self-pity, you know, woe is me type stuff. It wasn't fair, and it's not fair, but can kind of spiral into that too. And then just a few comforting practices and principles. I think patience is something that has really helped me. A lot of poor impulse control and rash decisions have propelled me towards really negative outcomes. I think gratitude, coming into that contact with gratitude through mindfulness. So just becoming aware of when things are going okay, or when something feels good, like getting a good meal even, or taking a hot shower, just and being grateful for that really helps me find peace. And then when things are really bad, hope for hope's sake, you know, I'm just trying to, if I don't feel like I have hope, well, I'll hope for hope, because there needs to be something to fall back on when there's nothing else there. And another kind of philosophical aspect of this was I kind of shifted gears from trying to be happy and chase happiness into just living a meaningful life and kind of defining what that meant for me. And that was not in the pursuit of happiness, because I'm often not happy. And when I am happy, you can't really hold on to that feeling forever. So kind of shifting gears. The grief of expectations, simply what I mean by that is comparisons to others, societal, familial kind of expectations that we can't meet. Those things are not within my control and can be very damaging and very harmful. And kind of, like I said, developing that moral philosophy and value set so that ultimately, like, I know when I've done something wrong and it's because it's my values and not like something that's being prescribed to me. Try and power through this. So it's difficult. I think the current healthcare systems, work, school, and even personal and romantic relationships are very difficult for someone with a chronic mental health condition to navigate. I think cookie cutter decisions often don't work the best, at least in my things. I think these problems are too complex, need to continue to seek alternate methodologies and ways of doing things. In the same way that an addict won't go to a party where there's going to be a lot of drinking, I kind of scaffold my life in that same way, where I avoid situations that'll be triggering. I give myself an out, and then I try and pursue things where I know I'm going to be okay. And then I've had to change what success looks like, and I leave that pretty fluid and pretty adaptive. That's an ongoing thing, because a lot of the traditional ways just don't apply to my current life. The continuing struggle of blaming others, being in denial versus taking the responsibility and dealing with a little bit of the shame and guilt is something that is an ongoing process. I think I've gotten a lot better at it, but that's, continues to be an issue. Through that, the cycle of trauma and dealing with the kind of web that has created in my life is another ongoing issue that requires attention and is not something to be, pushed to the side in an effort to be responsible. Fundamentally, I harp on this a little bit in this presentation: give yourself time and give yourself a break. This is kind of the last major section. I wanted to talk a little bit. I know there's a lot of family members and loved ones of people with mental health conditions in NAMI. These are some insights from both me and my family in terms of things that have helped me. Try to partner with them, not dictate or control the path. I know it's really difficult when someone is spiraling out of control. Somebody kind of needs to be at the reins, and there's points when that is necessary. But sometimes in order for that person to learn to become responsible, they kind of have to have the freedom to fail. My family didn't know what they didn't know, and so they had to educate themselves. They did that through NAMI in a lot of ways, and that helped them, better help me as well. I think fundamentally, a principle of just kind of giving them options and letting them choose is better than trying to force people into and pigeonhole them into specific treatments or modalities. Letting that process be a little more open, I think, understands the reality that you can't force this. You can't force someone to become responsible. It's a decision they have to make on their own. So just listening to them and trying to understand. We have had many conversations in my family about the tolerability of side effects. They can be a huge obstacle to compliance, and I think it would have been a different conversation if those weren't just rejected out of hand, because it's a huge issue for me in being compliant early on. I do think we all have a following an internal pull towards healing and survival. And so often that can look like avoidance or regression to someone on the outside. So, you know, someone after a psychotic episode just kind of hanging around, watching TV, sleeping all day. Well, I know that after many episodes of psychosis that I need that. And I just maybe don't want to get stuck in that, but I do need that for a time just to recover. Think being open to new modalities and responsibility and treatment modalities has really helped me. Most people in recovery, I think, would agree that treatment is rarely and recovery is rarely linear. It's not like a upward progression all the way through. There's ups and downs and back and forth. In my experience, there's definitely more than just medication and therapy, though those are an essential part of what has helped me. There's a lot more out there, so don't be afraid to like look at that and try and attack the problem from kind of a multitude of angles has been super helpful for me. So minding the basics, diet, exercise, and that sort of stuff, as well as like more traditional mental health treatment. So just helping shift the way of toxic shame and guilt would be things like the thing you did was hurtful, not like you are this way. Just little ways of helping them not identify so much with the mistakes that they're making or with the problems that they've had. This was a big one for me. I don't take aggressive criticism well. Also, if it's criticism of something that I can't do anything about, that is not helpful to me at all. So something that I can directly work something with. I think non-identification with the diagnosis was a huge thing for me. So not taking on the identity that I am a schizophrenic. I struggle with schizophrenia, or I have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. That is not the same as denying your condition. I think there's a little nuance there, and it's important because you take all the baggage that comes with the label. So you don't need to be the label. You can just be associated with it. You know, it's a lot easier to carry that way. For a long time, my family kind of saw me as weak and kind of fragile, I think, after my many episodes of psychosis. So it was helpful to kind of shed that belief, because I hid in that belief as well. I was like, oh yeah, that's me. Can't do anything, can't work, you know, not going to make big wide steps because I'm too fragile. And the weight of these diagnoses can feel kind of terminal. And I don't think that's always the case, which is another reason not to strongly identify with the diagnosis. I think, you know, from a family member perspective, one thing I wish I had early on, especially, was if they could be a little more charitable in my behavior and efforts, or sometimes the lack of effort. It takes time, this process. It takes repeated failures and giving up. And, you know, that's been my story of kind of putting things down and then picking it up again many years later. I think, you know, one treatment is not going to probably work for the rest of your life. It may, but I've had medications that have just quit working through no fault of my own. You build a tolerance. I've had modalities that were very helpful at one period that weren't later on. So be open to kind of helping your loved one find something different. Trying to create an open and supportive environment for discussing problems and ideas. This is a tricky one. People with psychosis or untreated delusions can often confront people with things that aren't real. So I would say you don't want to feed into that, but you also do want to kind of, you know, be open to hearing them out. And they obviously can start lying or hiding the truth if you aren't willing to hear them out. So it's a valuable thing in terms of building a partnership. I think parents, loved ones are not a substitute for professional support. That is one thing that I staunchly stand by. And then I think these problems are often too much for people to carry just on their own, even someone who's very mentally healthy and strong. So I encourage everyone to seek help and support as they would need it, and not to neglect their own well-being. The final couple slides here. The process of developing honest self-reflection and taking genuine ownership of ourselves and our conditions can be painful and should be balanced with compassion for ourselves and self-love. I do think this is a very hard, life is hard enough for anyone. And I think with these conditions, it's really hard. So have a little bit of appreciation for that when in terms of how you treat yourself and how maybe how you treat others. It's difficult to convey these experiences, and I'm sure it's very difficult to understand. So that's another major obstacle. I'll reiterate this: give yourself a break, extend the charitability you receive, and give yourself time. And it's not something you can do all at once. Last slide. Self-love, I think that's a practice. I don't think a lot of us come to that naturally. I think it's not just a feeling that we have for ourselves. It's something you have to work at. It's really important when it's difficult. That process for me looks like challenging the lies of depression, the lies of my psychotic experiences, fighting toxic shame and guilt, and again, gratitude. It helps me stay super rooted in the good things I have going for me. I don't take things for granted as much, and I can act. Those are like the only times where I feel like genuine peace is when I'm like appreciating things that have gone okay. So I do think those practices are cumulative. So like those are my only suggestions or kind of prescriptions. Keep practicing those things. And that's it. I know I went a little over, but
you're fine, Daniel.
All right.
Once again, thank you so much for your candor and your courage in sharing your story. Your talk was powerful. The insights were compelling. It was obviously heartfelt. Kudos to you for the perseverance and vigilance you had in being on your journey to wellness and what you went through. I've been through a little bit of that myself, and I know how challenging it can be. And so basically, congratulations on having successfully been on that journey. And it's clearly, helped you immensely. With that, we do have some questions in the chat. One is very simply, but importantly, what kind of support from family was helpful?
I'll give a few examples. So there's one that, maybe 19-year-old me would really disagree with, but putting me in the hospital, that's going to be really controversial too. And, a younger me would have a really hard time with that. But there are times where, as traumatic as those places can be, I don't think they're wonderful houses of healing or anything like that, but where I need to be there. And so, I think putting me there is always a very difficult choice for everyone involved. It's very difficult to deal with, but that would be helpful. And then some of the support that was super helpful, there was a time when my mom was trying to help me find a job and she had talked to someone else. And I was getting so anxious and so worked up. I hadn't worked in 4 years. I was terrified to had so much anxiety built up around. I was making myself crazy. And she saw that and was like, it's okay. You don't have to do it right now. There'll be other jobs. There'll be other times. We'll help get you there over time. You don't have to do it right now. And that was just all that weight off my shoulders, maybe averted a mental health crisis. So those are a couple examples.
Yeah, those are good. I can relate to the family member encouraging you to be hospitalized. When my depression got dangerously dark 13 years ago, my family members just said, you've got to go to a 30-day inpatient program and really try to tackle this thing you've been struggling with. And they didn't force me to. And I was resistant at first, but it really helped save my life. So I can totally relate to that. We've got another question about making amends. In your experience, have you found making amends to be important to reducing shame, or is it healthier, that's making amends to others, obviously, or is it healthier just to move on with life, as difficult as it may be?
Both. There are amends that were easy for me. Like my family stuck with me and I'm stuck with them. So I'm going to try and make it right with them. There are people that I was close friends with, that I know I have hurt through my behavior. And that was always something I evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes the right answer in order to prevent additional harm is kind of a principle that I live by, is to not try and make direct amends. It's just to change the attitude or behavior on my end, and kind of through that change in my life, make a quiet amends, or write a letter and not send it. That's another thing I've done many times. And that's kind of my guiding principle. If I think, oh, well, you know, I'm finally ready to make amends 4 years after this person and I have quit talking, maybe I don't want to kick a hornet's nest for them as well as myself. Because if I do that, it's less about, you know, hurting myself at that point, but there's the very real reality that like a lot of these things can trigger psychosis or can trigger severe depression for me. And then it's like, here I am again in a depression that's theme is still this other person. And like, am I going to awaken that within myself and potentially make things worse? Like, so in those times, I do just think finding ways to move on, make those changes personally is how I kind of deal with it. But that's just my personal take on it.
Yeah. Thank you. Well said. We have a question around substance use and the fact that you, and I really appreciate that you highlighted that you had trouble with alcohol and drugs, and clearly exacerbated your situation, which is pretty common. And the question is, do you support people who seek alternative methods for staying sober? I'm not sure exactly what's meant by that, but this person mentioned they don't happen to participate in 12-step programs anymore. But if you just want to talk a little bit about what you found helpful in achieving and maintaining your sobriety.
Sure. Yeah, I don't use 12-step programs either. I've gone to a few in rehab. I went to drug rehab in the early days. I've gone to meetings with other people. One thing that helped me a little bit was SMART recovery. I found that to be helpful. I think even in mental health support groups and connections, so long as you are sober, I think you can get good support from there, because like there are going to be people with co-occurring kind of things going on there. I think that's an area where some sort of spiritual practice like meditation was a good one that I've used to help stay sober. And ultimately it really was just a fact of like coming to a place where I was willing to find out what life looks like without drugs or alcohol, and kind of stepping into that unknown space, and then finding, you know, doing what I had to do to manage within those spaces. I quit drugs and changed my addiction to gummy bears and cigars. So that was kind of my initial thing. I don't smoke cigars anymore, but I still eat a lot of gummy bears. So I think there's lots of roads to recovery, and it's not all it's not just, no one has an exclusivity contract on recovery.
Yeah, well put. And I personally have a weakness for gummy bears myself, so I can relate to that. We'd be remiss in not saying that you're getting a lot of accolades and thank yous in the chat, Daniel. So your talk was very, very much appreciated. Let's see, we've got another question here. Where did it go? Oh, how to relate to one who is in denial. I presume, about their mental health condition. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a tough one. I think I can just really speak from personal experience here. Young me, teenage me in particular, good luck. Like, good luck trying to get through that thick skull. I think it really was, in a lot of ways, something that was dependent on maturity. So allowing there were times in my life where I became more and more responsible. And even after kind of the turning point in Houston, I've had lots of ups and downs since then. But there were periods where I, getting to live on my own, trying to make things work with a disability check and a part-time job, and failing at that, and going back and forth between that. I think a huge portion of it in my life was maturity. And I think the ways in which I eventually kind of broke through with help, but also on my own, was kind of by learning to become responsible for something other than my mental health, my living situation, for example, and then that kind of translating into a level of maturity where I could look at things a little more honestly, and where I wanted to be independent. So I was willing to address the growing mental health concerns in order to achieve that and to stay with that. So.
Great, thank you. Getting a little short on time, but we've got a few more minutes here. What did you look for when in connecting with a therapist? What it was or is important to you in having a therapist that you found really, you could connect with and could be really beneficial to you?
I think when I was younger, it was someone who was going to call me on my BS. That is something that is a very double-edged sword, because you can often upset people and that can turn people off. But I know now I need that. I need someone who, because I'm really good at it. So I need someone who's going to be able to identify that and kind of call that out as they see it. And then things I look for now in recent years, I try and go into therapy with an idea of what I'm in therapy for. I have a mental health condition and I'm going into therapy. You can get stuff out of that if the therapist is good and they know where they're leading you. But I also try and find a therapist that might have a specific modality to treat a specific thing that I'm struggling with. Or I might find a therapist who has 20 years of experience dealing with PTSD. That's kind of what I'm looking for now, is less the managing the symptoms of my schizoaffective disorder and more like trying to treat the PTSD, because these things like feed into each other. So getting clear what I want out of therapy also can kind of help direct who I'm going to help with that.
Great. Thank you. So we're just about out of time. I do want to let all the audience members know, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that, well, actually, I don't think I did mention it, but we record these and they're up on our website. Jessica can describe how you access the various talks we've had over the last year and how you can access them. Obviously, Daniel's talk was very powerful, and others might be interested in taking an hour and getting what we all got in the last hour. So Jessica, if you want to mention how people can access our videos from all these info talks.
Sure. So we have a YouTube channel, and the email that you got today, I believe, should have a link at the bottom to that channel. But in a couple of days, we'll get this back on the website, and I'll send another email with the link. So you can access it.
Great. And if you're not already a NAMI member, we would love for you to become a member. It's one of the more affordable memberships of any nonprofit that I'm aware of, $40 for an individual and $60 for a family. We'd love to have you join us as a member. And then as a reminder, Daniel's going to be a hard act to follow. But next month we have the Chief Medical Officer for the National Alliance on Mental Illness at the national level, Dr. Ken Duckworth, who will be going over our new book, NAMI's new book, You Are Not Alone, a NAMI Guide to Navigating Mental Health. So please let everyone know about that. We'd love to see you again next month, Tuesday, August 8th at 6 p.m. And with that, do you have anything else more to add, Jessica?
No, just thank you, Daniel. Every time you talk, I get something out of it. And actually, a lot of what you described, it could apply to my life as well, even though I don't live with a mental health condition that I know of. So thank you so much. It's
Great.
awesome.
Indeed.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very,
Once
very
again, thank you,
good
Daniel.
presentation.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate you hearing me
Good to
out.
see you.
Thank you.
Thanks to
Bye.
everyone for attending, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.